Hi everyone, welcome back to Esio Trot Part 2. Let's see what Mr. Hoppy's plan was with the tortoises. Before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage, and now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he might use his old bench for an hour or two. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. This was not difficult for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. First, he made two metal claws or fingers, and these he attached to the end of a long metal tube. He ran two stiff wires down the inside tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when you pulled the wires, the claws closed, and when you pushed them, the claws opened. The wires were joined to a handle at the other end of the tube. It was all very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So, on that first exciting afternoon, after he had made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out to his balcony armed with his long metal pole. He called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and lowered the pole down to Mrs. Silver's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "You are about to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above Alfie. He pushed the hand lever so that the claws opened wide. Then he lowered the two claws neatly over Alfie's shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed tightly over the shell like two fingers of a hand. He hauled Alfie up onto his own balcony. It was easy. Mr. Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales, just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct. And it was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tortoises to find one that first of all had the same colour shell as Alfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. 2 ounces is not much. It is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice. From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more and no less. When he had got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he could barely tell what one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2. Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 out onto the balcony and gripped it in the claws of his tortoise catcher. Then he lowered it onto Mrs. Silver's balcony right beside the nice fresh lettuce. Tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender, juicy lettuce leaves before. It had only had thick old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and started chomping away at it with great gusto. There followed a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mrs. Silver to return from work. Would she see any difference between the tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a very tense moment. Out on her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. "Alfie, my darling," she cried out. "Mummy's back. Have you missed me?" Mr. Hoppy, peering over his railing, but well hidden between two huge potted plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chomping away at the lettuce. My, Alfie, you do seem hungry today," Mrs. Silver was saying. "It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you." Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silver picked the tortoise up and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hoppy's piece of paper out of her pocket and, holding the tortoise very close to her face, she whispered, reading from the paper, "Esio Trot, Ted regib regib. Imok no Esio Trot. Werg poo, puff poo, toos poo, gnurps poo, woll poo, loos poo, eggrog, elzug, foots plug. Tut no taff, Esio Trot. Tut no taff, techno, elbdog, doof. Mr. Hoppy popped his head out of the foliage and called out, "Good evening, Mrs. Silver. How is Alfie tonight?" "Oh, he's lovely," Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming, "and he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words." "You never know," Mr. Hoppy said darkly. "You never know." Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces, 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection, he easily found a 17-ounce tortoise, and once again he made sure the shells matched in colour. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. As you will have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, I mean very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice that it has grown at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They are actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice until they grow out of their clothes. Slowly does it, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry it. So, this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Alfie weighed 13 ounces. End of first week, tortoise number 2 weighed 15 ounces. End of second week, tortoise number 3 weighed 17 ounces. End of third week, tortoise number 4 weighed 19 ounces. End of fourth week, tortoise number 5 weighed 21 ounces. End of fifth week, tortoise number 6 weighed 23 ounces. End of sixth week, tortoise number 7 weighed 25 ounces. And end of the 7th week, tortoise number 8 weighed 27 ounces. Alfie's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over the 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had been more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over the railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once had she looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting bigger. What do you think?" "Oh, I can't see a lot of difference myself," Mr. Hoppy answered casually. But now perhaps it was time to call a halt, and that evening Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out and suggest to Mrs. Silver that she ought to weigh Alfie, when a startled cry from the balcony below brought him outside fast. "Look!" Mrs. Silver was shouting. "Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously." "Weigh him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and weigh him quick." Mrs. Silver did just that, and in half a minute she was back holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy, guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before." "Oh, you darling," she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great big wonderful boy. Just look at what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course you can," Mrs. Silver cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed down the stairs and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together they went out on the balcony. "Just look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "Oh, he's a good big-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. "And you did it," Mrs. Silver cried. "You're a miracle man. You are indeed." "But what am I going to do about his house?" Mrs. Silver said. He must have a house to go into at night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing on the balcony, looking at the tortoise, who was trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "Oh, I shall have to enlarge the door," Mr. Puppy said. "Don't do that. You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to be just a bit smaller, and he could get in easily." "How can he possibly get smaller?" Mrs. Silver asked. "Oh, that's simple," Mr. Hoppy said. "Change the magic words. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller. But in tortoise language, of course." "Will that work?" "Of course it will. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy." Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, Esio Trot, teg a tib, relums a tib relums." "That'll do it, Mrs. Silver," he said, handing her the paper. "Oh, I don't mind trying it," Mrs. Silver said, "but look here, I wouldn't want him to get titchy small all over again, Mr. Hoppy." "He won't, dear lady, he won't," Mr. Hoppy said. "Say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky." "If it works," Mrs. Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, "then you are the cleverest man alive." The next morning, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise from up her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do now was to find one that was a shade smaller so that it would just go through the door of the little house. He chose one and lowered it down, and with his tortoise catcher. Then, still gripping the tortoise, he tested it to see if he would go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to await Mrs. Silver's homecoming. That evening, Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silver's shouts from below, shrill with excitement. Mr. Hoppy, where are you?" she was shouting. "Just look at this." Mr. Hoppy popped his head over the railing and said, "What's up?" "Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it worked," she was crying. "Your magic words have worked again on Alfie. He can now get through the door of his little house. It's a miracle." "Can I come down and have a look?" Mr. Hoppy shouted back. "Come down at once, my dear man," Mrs. Silver answered. "Come down and see the wonders you have worked upon my darling Alfie." Mr. Hoppy turned and ran from the balcony onto the living room, jumping on tiptoe like a ballet dancer between the sea of tortoises, and covered the floor. He flung open his front door, flew down the stairs 2 at a time, and with the love songs of 1,000 cupids ringing in his ears. "This is it," he whispered to himself under his breath. "The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I mustn't bish it. I mustn't bosh it. I must keep very calm." When he was 3/4 way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver already standing at the open door, waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him with a huge smile and cried out, "You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea." "Oh, that's the very least that you deserve." Seated in a comfortable armchair, Mrs. Silver's parlour, sipping tea, Mr. Hoppy was all of a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him. That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Mrs. Silver, please, will you marry me?" "Why, Mr. Hoppy," she cried, "I didn't think you'd ever get round to asking me. Of course I'll marry you." Mr. Hoppy got rid of his teacup, and the 2 of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. "It's all due to Alfie," Mrs. Silver said, slightly breathless. "Good old Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "We'll keep him forever." The next afternoon, Mr. Hoppy took all his other tortoises back to the pet shops and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tortoise. A few weeks later, Mrs. Silver became Mrs. Hoppy, and the 2 of them lived happily ever after. So Mr. Hoppy's plan did work. I hope you enjoyed the story. Bye for now.